When I was halfway through kindergarten, my family moved from Northwest Iowa to St. Louis because my dad had taken a new job with a company called Boise Cascade. If you know anything about Boise Cascade, they are a paper company. And at that point in time, just up the street from my high school, there was a plant. It's still there. And that plant made oil cans. Back in that time, they had those cardboard quarts of oil, like it had a tin top and a bottom, and a cardboard part of the can that was what carried oil that we now get in plastic bottles. We would go to work with my dad on a Saturday sometimes if he had to kick off a computer program or check on something. And mostly we visited the computer room, which had this floor that you could lift squares of it up to get to the cables and stuff underneath. They had a big suction cup for that. We would stick that suction cup on the wall and sit in somebody's office chair and spin ourselves around. We knew which lady's desk had M&Ms on it, and we would just kind of kick around the computer room there while he worked. One time, though, and this was around the time when I was in 6th or 7th grade, we went to visit, and he took us into the plant for the first time. My first visit to a big manufacturing facility, and in there we saw stacks and stacks and stacks of these oil cans on pallets, all wrapped up and ready to be shipped out to the companies that put motor oil in them. But after seeing that, he took us around to the other side of the plant, and there was this huge piece of equipment. And it was, I think, rotating, and it had this stuff that was happening. It was an injection molder that was making plastic bottles, very much like the ones we buy motor oil in today. I didn't know it at the time, but I was witnessing a huge transition in a consumer product from one way of packaging to another, all because of new technology. Now, I know this was in 6th or 7th grade because in 7th grade, we almost had to move to South Carolina because Boise Cascade sold that division to their competitor. Now, what I'm about to share, I didn't check the facts on this. I'm going on what I remember my dad telling me when I was like 13. And what he told me was that Boise Cascade had a massive share of the market of those consumer oil containers, something like 98%. And when they sold to the 2%. And even at that age, with no understanding of business, that seemed an interesting exercise in corporate discipline to me. That you would dominate a market and yet sell to the competitor when you're dominating it. And I tried to imagine that meeting, and in that meeting, I think maybe the CEO and the board of directors, whoever would have been around, somebody said, you know, we're a paper company, not a plastic company. We should sell off that oil can division because it's starting to become plastic and not paper. And I have to think somebody in the meeting said, well, we have been a paper company, but we could be something different. We dominate this market. Why would we get rid of a perfectly good opportunity to have such a market dominance in that space? But ultimately, they decided that they were a paper company. They stuck true to that identity. And I share this story today because organizations themselves don't technically have a memory, right? It's not a being, but the people in it do. And to the extent that the people remember who they are as a company, the company remembers who it is. And it doesn't have to be a company. It can be a school or a not-for-profit organization or even the church. Sometimes we remember who we are, and sometimes we forget. I think of Enron. That was a big, nasty mess, right, in our economy and people losing everything they had. And Arthur Andersen was their accounting company. At some point in time, I would imagine that most of the people that worked in those places had a sense of who they were and who they collectively were. But somewhere along the line, choices started to get made. There were probably, I am certain, people who had been perfectly ethical all their careers, and all of a sudden someone asked them to do something, to fudge some numbers or to shred a document or whatever it was that they kind of said, well, I don't know. But then they had a mortgage, kids in college, debts to pay off, and this job was paying those bills, and so maybe they just did that little bit and then maybe a little bit more, and pretty soon you have a huge catastrophe on your hand because some of the people forgot who they were, and then the organizations forgot who they were. Today we encounter a gospel passage where I believe what is happening is God's people have forgotten who they are. But before we get to that story, we have to back up because it doesn't start with Jesus and the disciples. From the very beginning, God calls Abraham and says, I am sending you to a place that I will show you, and you will be the father of countless descendants, and you are blessed to be a blessing. And as the people of Israel journey through their time and in their conversation with God, they are reminded again and again that they are God's priestly people and blessed to be a blessing, right, for the world. All of this means that God intends for them to live in a different way than the paradigms that they see around them. You think about when the people of Israel were enslaved in Egypt, they lived under the paradigm of Pharaoh. Walter Brueggemann talks about this, right? It's a paradigm where there is power, there's wealth, there's disparity, there are people that are enslaved. There's, with that power, right, there's military might, there's security that has to enforce all of that. And when the people are freed from slavery and they're out in the wilderness, they live by a completely different paradigm. They don't have a Pharaoh. They don't have this military might that enforces their life together. They don't have economics of production. God feeds them day by day as they go. This is a different paradigm that they are learning as God's people that are set apart to live differently. Eventually, they do make it to the land that was promised to them, and after some time there, they ask God for a king. And it's only a few generations before Brueggemann points out that Solomon puts back into place the paradigm of Pharaoh, where you have wealth and armies that help you keep it that way, and disparity between those that have and those that have not. They were called to be God's priestly people that were set apart to live differently, and they forgot. Now, they had reminders. The prophets would come along and say, hey, God told us to take care of the orphans and the widows, to beat our swords, our weapons into plowshares, right? Weapons becoming instruments of the growing of food for sustenance. That was the prophet's role, right? It was to remind the people who they were when they had forgotten. Now, that all fast forwards then to Jesus, who, in his entire earthly ministry, is reminding God's people who they are. He doesn't necessarily point back to those stories all the time, but he teaches them and shows them. He talks about the greatest commandment being love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. He washes the disciples' feet and tells them, look, I'm showing you how to serve one another, and this new commandment I give you is to love one another so that people will know that you are my disciples, which means their love will demonstrate that they are an alternative community that lives different from the paradigms of empire around them. Everything he does, from telling them to turn the other cheek, to praying for their enemies, to healing people on the Sabbath, to dining with the people who are left out and those who are in power. Like, Jesus lived in a different way, and all of those 12 and the 70 and the people that followed him around were learning to live in this alternative way of love and forgiveness and mercy and compassion that was not the way of the empire. And what we encounter today are some disciples that forgot. They forgot who they were, and because they forgot, the whole sort of forgot. James and John approach Jesus with this tricky question, and they come at it kind of manipulatively, saying, hey, will you give us what we ask, instead of just asking? And what they ask are for the seats on the right and left of Jesus when he comes into his glory. These are requests to have positions of power when Jesus comes into his power. This is a paradigm that they would have learned from the empire around them, and it is not what Jesus has been inviting them into as a way of life. And we know this because he has to reiterate again, as the other disciples get angry, that they are not the ones to be served, but to serve, and that the Son of Man came to give his life and to serve rather than be served. So they have forgotten who they are, and they're reverting to the way of life they see around them, not the one that Jesus has invited them to. We, present-day people, also forget who we are as the church. And it's not the church that forgets, but we as individuals that forget. Just as Jesus told them, right, our love for one another and for the world around us and for our enemies and for people that are persecuted and struggling should be so obvious that people will know that we are followers of Jesus. I wonder how often that's actually the case. Do people see us and see such radical forgiveness and mercy and compassion that that's what they know us by, or is it something else? They've done surveys of the church, not just like our congregation, but like the whole of Christianity, how it's perceived in our culture. And often it's that it's hypocritical and mean and not welcoming and all sorts of other things that are not the alternative way that Jesus invites us to live. They're exactly the way the world around us is. Jesus tells them that they're Gentile rulers or tyrants that lord it over them. We also have tyrannical rulers in our world. We who live in a democracy may say ours aren't, but on any given day, probably about half of us think our rulers are tyrants and the other half think they're great. Or we think they're all crooked and we just have to live with it, right? So we're not far off from what Jesus said. But in addition to those civic rulers, we also have corporate lords that have these massive international corporations that do things that are beyond our grasp to see all the time, but do end up getting lorded over us. And we have a new one that they didn't have, which is social media. In recent weeks, we've been hearing about Facebook and the ways that it has increased or contributed to our divisiveness because of those algorithms that we don't understand or have any control over. And what we get put in front of our eyes isn't necessarily what we would choose when we're on those platforms, which means that they are lording that over us in a way as well. And with all of that going on, it is easy to forget who we are as God's people, who Jesus calls us to be as an alternative community. So that when we're just clicking share on those posts that get us amped up, or when we're participating in the world around us in exactly the same way empires have always gone, we've forgotten. Which brings me to the part of this story that I love. Most of the times when we participate in some kind of an organization, there has been a process for us to get there, right? You have to sign up and fill out an application, say, to get a job. My dad's job at that place, he had to go through an interview and a hiring process before he could be a part of that organization. Sometimes there's dues that we have to pay or other activities that we have to go through to earn a spot in that organization. And the church, certainly, we have baptism as this entry point, but it is for all, not just for those that pass a test, right? And as we come to the church, right, the story today isn't an ending point. The disciples haven't passed all the tests and done all the things they knew to be a part of this church that Jesus is putting together and teaching to live in a different way. No, the starting point is their identity as God's people. Jesus says to them, it is the Gentile leaders that lord it over you. But then he says, it is not so with you. He says that not when the disciples are successful in doing everything in the alternative way that Jesus invites them. He says that when they're failing. He looks at James and John and the others and says, this isn't who you are. The world around you works this way, but it is not so with you. He's reminding them that they are fearfully, wonderfully, belovedly made children of God who are meant to carry that wonderfulness out into the world and shape the community and culture around them to be different. They forget, but Jesus doesn't punish them for forgetting or kick them out for forgetting. He reminds them that the starting point is who they are as God's people. Fearful, wonderful, beloved, and blessed to be a blessing. And so it is for us. We don't always forget who we are. The church quietly does tremendous things in this world with generosity and acts of service and forgiveness and mercy and compassion and all of the things that Jesus teaches us to do. But we also forget. And when we forget, the important part for us to remember isn't that we have to earn our way back in, but we are reminded that when we forget and are participating in the destructive, death-dealing ways of the world around us, that it is not so with us. That we already are fearfully, wonderfully made, blessed children of God, blessed to be a blessing. Jesus was telling that to the disciples before he had even died and been raised. It was already true that they were chosen by God, right? We, as the people post-resurrection, have the story of Jesus' death and resurrection to remind us that we are freed of those ways and that resurrection gives us this new life. We talk about the water and the table as reminders of who we are and whose we are as God's children. And today I want to say that we are also to be reminded that we are a paper company. Just as those containers of oil paper containers could carry a liquid, right? We as the church carry these waters of baptism. They are in and among us, and we carry them with us everywhere we go. And you can turn paper into a plate, right? We have a plate and a cup behind us at this table that we celebrate, and they carry that sacramental gift of a meal that reminds us who we are. And you can write on paper, right? You can write words. Scripture is written on paper, and we carry that written word and our spoken word and our actions out into the world to remind people that they are wonderfully made human beings, created to be a blessing for others. Plastic gets injected, molded by a big machine, but paper, you got to cut down a tree and reshape it and transform it. That's exactly what happened with the cross. A tree was cut down, it was shaped into this other thing, but Jesus took that instrument of death and transformed it into an experience of life. And Jesus then takes that cross and resurrection and carries this water and carries this meal and carries this gift of grace to us as a starting point each day to remember, it is not so with you, those death-dealing ways, but you are wonderfully blessed to carry this out into the world. And it's from that starting point, this gift of life, that we encounter others. I remember a retreat I once went on with some kids. At the end of the retreat, we shared letters with them that told them what a blessing they were. Many of them, I don't think, had ever been told that. We were having to remind them something they didn't even know. One girl cried so hard she threw up, and when I asked her what was going on, she said, "How can they say such nice things when I'm so terrible?" We as God's people get reminded today that it is not so with us, that we can indeed carry blessing into the world because it's who we were created to be. And when we carry that with us, because God works through us, because that is our starting point, other people will be blessed. On our great days we remember, on other days we forget, and either way, it is not so with us. We are indeed instruments of grace sent into this world for the sake of the world, to carry that grace and love with us to touch other lives as we go. Amen.